All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Parker Pearson with Denoma Software. We're going to go ahead and get started on time. A couple of housekeeping items. So today's session we run in WebEx, and we're going to handle the Q&A two different ways today. So you have the option to either enter your question into the Q&A panel. If it is not showing on the right-hand side of your screen, take your mouse and go down to the control buttons at the bottom. You'll see there's a circle that has 3 dots in it that says more options, and you should be able to select, sorry, the 3 dots is the one way on the right-hand side that's your panels, and you can select Q&A. So if you're not seeing Q&A, just check that, and then that will pop up on the right-hand side. So you can put your questions in as we go along. Feel free to enter them so you don't forget them. Or if you would like, you can raise your hand when we get to the Q&A section, and you can actually talk interactively with us, ask your questions. You have both options. Today's event is being recorded, so you'll get that recording and you'll be able to refer back to it. I think you'll find it very helpful. So let's go ahead and kick off today's session. We're running this because at Denoma, we see that cybersecurity is a critical part of a data protection and business continuity strategy. And we provide solutions in that area, but we wrap those around with a belief in the importance of cybersecurity. Well, in order to get started on your cybersecurity stance, the first step is to make sure that you've got an updated plan that gets reviewed at least annually and make sure that it's in alignment with best practices, which brings us to today. What I brought here together today is we've got sort of a two-part format for today's educational event. In the first half, one of our partners, GuardSight, will be talking through the elements of best practice in a cybersecurity incident readiness and response plan, and really talking through that. And then once he's done with that, we're going to move into a much more interactive Q&A discussion. It was really important to us that this be interactive and give you the opportunity to ask your questions. So Ryan and John from GuardSight will be speaking from the cyber planning readiness. Eric Thompson from one of our partners, Advanced Logic Industries, he brings the perspective that some of you on the call have from being the IT management and administration in the field. And then if we have any questions that cover into information governance or compliance, well, that's my area. And if anything rolls into that area, I can help with that. So with that said, I'd like to hand this off to John. And I think we're in for a really productive session today. John?
Okay, thank you, Parker. I appreciate that. So just to confirm, Parker, you can see the presentation I have on the screen. We're good to go there?
Yes, sir.
Outstanding. Okay, my name is John McLaughlin. I am the founder and CEO of GuardSight. GuardSight is tactical cybersecurity as a service company. So we help customers with three main aspects of cyber, what we'll call operations, assessments, and response. And the easy way to think about what we do is like the acronym OAR, or in a boat. And today what I'm going to be talking to you about is just preparing for a cyber fight. If you have a successful attack, being able to get yourself in that position. Background on me, I started my career in the late 80s, so I'm old. You can see that from my gray hair. And I started in the Silicon Valley, and I've had a long career. And GuardSight's a 13-and-a-half-year-old company. We're coming up on 14 years. And I spent a lot of time in the tactical end of cyber. I was on the SOC team at Bank of America for a while, and worked in lots of big SOCs around the country, security operations centers. And so I've got a lot of experience. These days I'm not on the ground anymore like I used to be, the cyber ground, but still know a lot about it. And the deck that I'm going to give the team today is one of my favorites, because it talks about just getting yourself in that mindset of tactical response when you do get into a fight, and how to actually do that. So with that, let's get going. I also have my colleague Ryan Loya, who's on my team, and of course, Eric Thompson. The Denoma team is an awesome partner for GuardSight. So what I'm going to do is just go through this deck real quick. Parker mentioned that we're kind of split this up in two. So what I'd like you to do is, as I'm discussing stuff, if you see a slide that you like and you want to talk about it, make just a mental annotation or an annotation on your side, and then we could throw it in the Q&A and come back and talk about it. This is a TLP white presentation. So for those of you that aren't familiar with TLP, that's traffic light protocol. Just essentially, this is a public presentation. You can actually get this on the GuardSight GitHub, which I think we have references for later on. So if you want to go get the same exact presentation for posterity on your side, we give it away to the community. This isn't going to be a 3-hour presentation, but typically what we do is we provide these what we'll call tabletop exercises, or TTXs. Like a lot of cyber and tactical type stuff, there'll be a lot of acronyms in here today, and I'll try to make sure I get those out for you. But TTX, if you hear that, that is a tabletop exercise. Some of you may have gone through tabletop exercises. Some of you may know what they are. Some of you may never have gone through one before. We actually offer 2 types of tabletop exercises. This is our standard TTX, and we also have what's called the TTX Enhanced, where we include a cyber range as part of that exercise so that we can get your tactical teams actually in a full simulation of a cyber range. But during these TTXs, the number one thing that we try to, the main objective of a tabletop exercise is to ensure incident response mission readiness. And so it's easy to say that, but I can tell you that, in the hundreds and probably, I guess, maybe thousands of, cyber and, conflicts that I've been involved with, there's always that fog of war, if you will. And so it's easy to say that, but you need to practice it, and you need to be doing it. And so that's the objective. And I would also say you have to rewire yourself for speed. So organizations, size dependent, aren't often built that way, and bad guys are. So you need to get into that mindset. Like when we are engaged by a threat actor, we need to be able to have, what we'll call quick reaction forces on these guys to be able to respond and contain the threat. What we try to, the results for, if you could kind of think about it like objective and key results, the results that we're looking for, the key results that we're looking for in a TTX are those, essentially those 9 things there, operational roles, who's in charge, who does what, how do we move together as a team? So we'll call that operational choreography. Just the various TTP that we run during these things, tactics, techniques, and procedures, understanding what our critical containment assets are. So one of the things that'll happen during a fight is you have, tools, weapons, assets at your disposal that can be used to fight the bad guys. They're using assets against you, their assets against you, and sometimes they're using your own assets against you. So it's important to understand that cyber battlefield, where these things are, what they can be used for in form of containment, in eradication, and recovery. The number 5 on that is also critically important, which is IT support teams, incorporating IT support teams. So cybersecurity teams within any organization typically do not own assets. And so they need the assistance of these IT support teams when we issue what are called courses of action. You'll see the acronym COA. And so we'll issue courses of action to IT support teams. A simple example of that could be, block, this particular, site or this particular IP address at a firewall because we know it's a known, bad C2 and we see traffic going to it. Typically, the cybersecurity teams wouldn't actually be the ones that were implementing that. They would contact an IT support team to do that. And so if you contact the IT support team and it takes them 3 days to get that done for you, they don't know who you are. They never talked to you before. They don't trust you. They're not authorized to do it without change control. There's no exception process for that. All that stuff is critically important, and it happens oftentimes. And so it's speed that we're looking for. So, the concept is that we have a concept in cyber, for those of you that don't know it, called dwell time, which is essentially the time that the threat actor lands in your environment to the time that you fully eradicate them. But we'll call it, in this particular case, the time that they land to the time that you contain them. And as you can imagine, through common sense, the longer the threat actor, is in your environment, the longer the dwell time, the better chance they have of causing more damage. And so you want to contain them as quick as possible. So all of the IT support teams that could be involved in this process are critically important. I'm going to talk about business stakeholders too, including communications up and down the chain. One thing that's difficult for cyber teams when they're in the fight is because they don't have a good incident command feeding situation reports or sit reps up the chain of command. The chain of command is looking for data coming down because they need to make decisions. And we also may be looking for authorization to do certain things because depending on how much it could impact the business. I mean, there's always collateral damage in these types of things. And if we're not sending those proper comms up, we can expect that we're going to get a flood of questions coming down. And those questions are usually repetitive. And there's also, a fog of decision making that happens there. So we want to talk about how to work together with the business stakeholders. Fatigue management is critically important. You can kind of think about, depending on the size of your organization, you may only have 1 or 2 IT teams members on your team. You may have 30 IT members and, a large security team. But the reality of it is that, well, people sleep and sometimes they're not around. They're on vacation or whatever they're doing. And when you go into a fight, especially if it's going to be a long fight, you have to prepare for fatigue management. And the way that you do that is you develop a comms plan with your team that says, this is how we're going to manage that. And what situations reports do is allow us to transfer data from one team to another. So maybe the shifts are, we're going to go on 10 or 12-hour shifts during the fight, and we'll have 2 shifts. But when I transfer data from one team to another, there's this consistent, cohesive flow. Because typically we don't turn the lights out, go home, and then come back and continue the fight the next day. That's generally not a good idea unless you've got it fully contained. And then just, we generally give scenarios and then identify the opportunities for improvement from those scenarios. Today, we're not going to, actually go through a TTX or a scenario. It's just to give the audience a perspective of what these things look like. So again, this isn't, a 3-hour thing here, but these are typically what agendas look like. There are all the things that I discussed up top. And, these are the things that are important. Where are we going to do it? Who's the facilitator? Who's taking minutes? Who's participating? How is our question and answer protocol? What's our etiquette? The idea is like, you don't need to bring your phone and stare at your phone every 5 seconds. We want to, get rehearsed here. We want to practice like we're going to fight, that type of deal. What breaks look like, sustenance, that kind of stuff. We're not going to be doing any of that today. Here is some of the resources that I talked about. There's a couple really good resources here that you want to take a look at. The first one will be that GitHub Calm. There's an IR plan up there. This deck is also up there so that you can look at that. And the mission model is a after action report template that you can use. The incident response playbook battle cards are excellent. They're essentially what you're looking over here on the right. Pickerel, P-I-C-E-R-L, preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. Those are matrices of the Pickerel model and different playbooks for how to fight when certain types of attacks happen. And they're also mapped to the MITRE attack framework. So if you're familiar with that, you'll notice that. The difference between the two is these are kind of simplified versions of that, so that when you're in the fight and you need to think quick, these will be a little bit easier, and they're more layman perspective than they might be, a surgical cyber person, if you will. A good way to think about them that I always use the allegory for that is if you ever see an NFL quarterback on TV, or even a college quarterback where they've got that playbook on their forearm, that's kind of the same concept there. So they're one-pagers, easy to understand. They're based on PICERL, which is a standard. It's not a standard that we invented. It came out of SANS, but we use it in the industry. Generally all cyber fighters understand that model. And then the last one is just some internal stuff about how to actually conduct internal security incident response activities. I would say the first top one, if you don't have an IR plan, just grab that. You've got one now, and you can modify it to meet your company's specific things. I mentioned the Pickerel model. Here's a guiding resource for that, which is SANS 504B incident response cycle. It's a cheat sheet, and it'll give you an example of what Pickerel actually looks like. If you're taking screenshots at home of that, this is great. I think Parker also mentioned that this recording will be available to you. But we kind of think about the courses of action in terms of this. And so this is a good model, and it's easy to remember. Pick a rule like the fish. It's simple. So when you get into that fight, acronyms are good. 1, 2, 3 simple things are good. Like move quickly. If you've got these complicated things, some of you that are tactical may know these. Like you brought in a consultant, they wrote you this like, incident response plan, long playbook thing. Nobody actually ever read it. Nobody actually uses it. No tactical person would ever use it. There's no connection between the two. This kind of eliminates that and gets us thinking about like, we need to move with speed here. And this model is really good. So number one priority in any cyber fight or in any cyber attack is this right here. So if you're thinking, what am I supposed to do? The first place you need to start with is contain the threat. It makes no difference if the threat actor is continuing to move to your and through your environment, creating destruction or whatever their particular actions on objective are. If you are not in the mindset of containing the threat, you will die. It's just that simple. So you have to contain the threat. So you have to locate the point of attack, go to the threat actor, contain the threat actor, and then work on eradicating the recovery of the asset. And so a lot of times what happens is people will stand around and they don't know what to do or what they do. If you didn't know what to do, think about some common sense things. First thing is contain the threat. Okay, so let's talk about some operational roles. You'll kind of see two sections here. You've got this left side, which I'll call just the business, the business itself. So you've got legal, which is most likely going to be involved, depending on the serious nature of it, and you most likely will have external counsel as well. So for those of you that haven't been involved with that, typically what happens is let's say, for example, it's a ransomware attack or it's some cyber attack. You would contact your insurance broker to find out, like, do you have coverage for it? Will they pay for it? They will generally contact what they'll call as a breach advisor. And the breach advisor will be a law firm that they have in their stable. And that breach advisor typically has an incident response firm. And so GuardSight often works, we'll get called for that from law firms, but we also work alongside other firms that get called by law firms. So don't be surprised by that, where we're both, conducting some responsibility. Sometimes the insurance company will just have your, if GuardSight Denomo is your, providing you your SecOps service, they'll just have them handle it. It varies depending, but generally you're going to have some, legal or insurance external involved with it. Of course, the C-suite's interested in this because they have to make decisions. We'll talk about that. HR might be interested in it because you might have, exfilled PII data about your employees. There might be other issues going on with that. Of course, your compliance teams, Parker talked about, maybe some governance, GRC type questions at the end she can handle. Business units, asset holders. So if you have multiple business units they're going to be concerned about that. Like, are our assets up? Can we conduct business? That kind of stuff. How do I deal with my customers on this? Stakeholders, LEO might be involved with it. Public relations, really critically important, depending on the size of the breach, how you actually, media out this. It's always good to try to get out in front of this stuff than to, cover it up or, do anything like that, because ultimately it ends up getting up. And how you control the employees that are under non-disclosure in your company from tweeting about it. Hey, I think we got hacked today because our computers are down, that kind of stuff. How do you control that? So I'll put all that stuff on the left. But it's important for you to understand that you need to have it. I generally don't deal with that stuff, or GuardSight doesn't, because we are on the right here, which is the team that's going to make contact with the enemy and deal with that. On the right, you'll see that we've got the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer or Director of Information Security, maybe a Chief Information Officer, but generally somebody in the organization who has authority and can make technology decisions when we request those. You'll see two arrows that are one going up, one going down, that are connected to CSIRT. CSIRT being Computer Security Incident Response Team, that's the main, but those two arrows are important. So SITREPs and AAR, so situation reports and after action reports, go up the chain. What situation reports do is they provide the Chief Information Security Officer or a command with data of potentially courses of actions that we would like to implement during the fight, and they will authorize those COA. That's why you see it coming back down the chain, because we may during a fight give the executives in the company, CISO executives, technology executives, 3, 4, 5 things that we want to do immediately. They're going to review those. To us, it might be the most common sense things to do. To them, it may be really bad for a reason that we don't understand. And we are not concerned about that. What we're concerned about was the authority, the order to go ahead and execute those courses of action. That's why you see those going up and down. And you'll see that again echoed between CSIRT and IT support, which is situation reports from IT support. Yep, we completed that, and us sending back down courses of actions to IT support. Now, when I say us in IT support, those may be one and the same, but it's just easier to demonstrate that here logically when we're showing it this way. Of course, the number one responsibility for the CSIRT, if you refer back to that pickerel model, the CER part of the pickerel model is containment, eradication, and recovery. And we are going to the enemy and bringing the fight to them and terminating their, containing them, and then eventually eradicating them fully from the network and recovering them. The box that says, incident command system or unified command, for any of those that are operate in the physical or the kinetic world, you may be familiar with this. It's basically the same thing. You've got an incident command system that also includes command centers, and the way that we communicate taxonomies, that's really important. Again, this is also for speed. So you can imagine the enemy comes in on your network, they compromise your assets. They don't know that you're prepared for them. And now that you're prepared for them, you're going to give them potentially overwhelming force. You're going to drive them out of your network. They're going to potentially go someplace else, depending on how long they've been in there. Here's some breakdown, a little bit more breakdown about those operational roles. And again, these can vary from team to team and how you do that, but it's really easy for people to understand that we need a mission captain or an incident commander. Who's in charge? Like, we need somebody like if we had to think about a command rank, who's going to make the call? Who's experienced? Who's authorized? That kind of stuff. While we've got our tactical teams, doing their jobs, we need people to do some coordination and some actual, calling the shots. So tactical authority, allocating resources to the fight, making sure, for example, that you've got the qualified resources in the fight, that they're familiar with the particular weaponry that you're using, they're maybe familiar with the actual topology of the environment, the cyber battlefield, as we would call it. Their comms and briefings to CISO. So one thing, for those of you that are experienced in this, it's always like, if you've ever been in a security operations center and you've got, a CISO comes in and they start talking to the commander, and you've got the new guy who wants to, show that he knows what he's doing, and he interjects a particular piece of information that wasn't necessary. That usually creates even more chaos. So what you want to do is you want to kind of get one voice on the team communicating up the chain. That's always a really smart thing to do. Everybody has, ideas, and we want those ideas, but it's how we comms up. Our situation report cadence, which tells command up the chain, hey, you can expect a situation report, once every 4 hours during this particular time period. And as things slow down, maybe once a day, whatever that is, the cadence is all varied. But what it does is it tells command when they can expect information from the teams that are in the fight. That stops people from coming down, asking questions, and interrupting the actual flow of the fight. So that's critically important. And then, of course, command is usually the custodian of the AAR. They own the after action report, and they'll disseminate that. Up on the top right, you'll see that OODA loop. Some of you are probably familiar with that. This is also a way for you to kind of think about controlling your breathing and just getting under control, and slow, smooth as fast type deal. Observe, orient, decide, and act. There's a couple other roles that are here important. You always want to bring a scribe if you have one. They're good for creating AAR journal entries. We always scribe as we go. Some teams will AAR journal entry at the end. I could tell you through experience that's a bad idea. You'll never remember the details and the nuances of a fight. It's easy to pull journal entries out and don't include them in the AAR rather than try to remember what happened during it. So it's good to just bring it. They also will take care of making sure that the command centers are open and that information's been disseminated. They'll take care of the evidence locker creations, that kind of stuff. And they'll also be responsible for sit reps and comms up the chain as well sometimes. And they could swap off with incident command too. They'll have some experience in there. So if incident command, for whatever reason, might be involved with legal, but we've got a scheduled sit rep, scribes can usually fill in for that. QRF personnel are typically your first responders. They're going to help impact assessments, severity rating. These are typically usually your most experienced team mates. They may also be involved during the fight, but generally they're the ones that are going to make first, land, make contact, evaluate what's happening, ask questions. They're going to give the initial containment course of action guidance. They're going to give, they're going to corroborate the fact that it is in fact an attack. They're going to talk to business owners. They're going to do a quick kill chain analysis, start operating, giving you some opportunities for improvement when the AAR is done. to get better. But these are generally, maybe one or two of your top personnel. Impact assessments are really critical to determine, what kind of force we want to apply to the problem. And then, of course, the people that actually do the work are what we'll call the virtual security operations center teams and IT support teams. They're the individuals that actually get the stuff. One thing you'll put in here, I put in here is just see flank observation, or what we call watch the wire. Just because you've been attacked successfully, typically what happens is everybody runs to the point of attack. That's a really bad idea because the other bad guys are still attacking you. And it might not be the same threat group. It might be other threat groups that have also discovered this particular vector, or for whatever reason, you're still being attacked. So if everybody's running to the point of attack, and over here, you've got your case system that just continues to load up with new cases as they're coming in on the wire, that's just like your normal daily, hygiene cadence, then you're going to have that problem you're going to have to deal with next. And there may be an attack in there that was successful. So you want to make sure you've got flank observation. Don't just pay attention to the point of attack, because you most likely are experiencing other attacks. Here's a general operational choreography if you wanted to see what that looks like. So you got QRF. They're generally in within the first 15 minutes. They'll perform an impact assessment, communicate a severity rating, start to develop some courses of action. Incident command comes in. You'll see this is speed. Like, you want to be in here within the first 3 minutes. You want to be on and ready to go. So if you do engage, your team should be prepared to fight with it. Everybody's, at the rally point and fighting within 30 minutes. You got to think about it that way. If you can get it faster than that, that's great. But this is probably what I would say would be ideal. First 15 minutes, you get a call that, something's happened. Your QRF team can respond and start to evaluate that. QRF says, yeah, this is legit. Incident command is ready to go. They already know their business. They know how to open up the commands. Scribes are ready. We've got CISOs engaged. We're starting sit reps. We're good. Up top on the right, you'll see breathe and OODA loops and reduce dwell time, contain the threat. That's our initial, operational choreography objective. And then we'll have these steady state mission engagement, which is contain, eradicate, and recover. Again, just reducing dwell time, containing the threat. And then you'll kind of see like what QRF, IC does, the scribes, and the actual support team. So once we, the first thing is, boom, we engage. Everybody knows what they're doing. I know what I'm doing. My colleague knows what they're doing. We all have our roles. We understand that. Some people are, involved with coordination and comms. Other people are involved with actually fight because they've got the experience to do that. They've got the weaponry to do that kind of stuff. And then when we're done, of course, we'll do what are called lessons learned or opportunities for improvement. I like opportunities for improvement over lessons learned. For me, it's a more forward connotation. It's a better way to think, because this stuff doesn't stop. Cyber's a journey, and so that's the kind of way I look at that. So I've got about 5 to 10 minutes here, so I'll get through this and then I'll stop. So just, basically for, how do we actually make assessments, ratings, so that's critically important too. So sometimes it's just, it's not news, it's weather. And understanding the difference between the two is important. And that's why experienced teams can help you with that. A good majority of the incident response that I was involved with throughout my career, actually, we never even received those from our telemetry or the weaponry that we had. It was from a user, some user in the environment. Probably the most common thing would be like the user calls and says, hey, I can't get into my files. And they've got these, funky, they don't know to say encryption, but they've been encrypted. Like, that's probably the most common thing. But there's other things in there too. Could be, denials of service because of the way the threat actor is working. The network's slow because the threat actors are egressing data out the network. I mean, there's all types of different things. Sometimes it's not the security teams to discover it. It's actually the business to do it. But, we want to inspect change logs. There's been times where, people have, freaked out, and it turned out it was a change, and there was actually a change log that had made the change. So it wasn't a bad event. It was an expected event. It just had benign, known good benign event caused some collateral damage that caused everybody to be on heightened awareness. That also happens sometimes too, like during the fight, because sometimes it wasn't communicated to the other IT teams that were in a fight. So changes on the network are still happening because they're scheduled to happen. And then, people see those changes and they're like, oh man, they're still attacking us. And the reality of it is, well, no, they're not. This is an IT change. And so that's why it's important to have those teams involved in the front, because sometimes what will happen is it might be two different, areas of, two AOs there, two areas of responsibility. and the individual is responsible for, on the one side, for the fight, and then the individual responsible on the other side for technology changes. They have to coordinate, and that person with the technology change responsibility may freeze all changes during the fight, so it's not to cloud or confuse the team. So we know that anything that happens is most likely not friendly, but it's quickly determining what's friendly and what's not. Asset owners about observed indicators of compromise is awesome. I learned this actually in a SOC fight one time, a cyber fight one time in the SOC. One of our members was a former FBI agent, and he left the SOC during the fight. And there was a bunch of hypotheses going on and what was happening. He came back about 5 minutes later and said, "Hey, I know what happened," because he had actually, was schooled in just, interrogation, if you will, and he just wanted to talk to some people. So talking to people is good if you can get them to give you factual data. We use what's called top indicators of compromise as a way to, determine the observed indicators of compromise. We use MITRE attack frameworks. You'll ask asset owners, was there a loss of data or was restricted data at risk? Because that changes the profile of the response sometimes, where you're going to need legal involvement now because you just leaked out, personally identifiable information about people, or depending on where you are, what that jurisdiction calls for regulation. So that's critically important. We've got confirmation that there was a loss of data. We've got confirmation that restricted data was at risk. I've seen everything you can possibly imagine leave networks, including, payroll, salaries, and stuff like that. Customer contact lists. The reason that that's important is because threat actors now are calling those individuals to let them know that you've been hacked and you're not willing to pay them. And, that's a big problem for you. So you have to understand, what the exposure is so that you can build a plan to deal with that. Like if you can build a plan to deal with that and get out in front of that, you're much better off than, getting beat up by the threat actor. And then just using severity rating models as the reasoning is good. So we use the NCCIC, CISS severity rating models. You can DuckDuckGo that and you'll see what that's all about. That gives us essentially a standard way to actually rate stuff. And if the executive teams are aware of that too, then they understand what the severe means versus what a medium means, for example. That's why you want to use those. Here's an example of an after action report. For journaling purposes, what these look like in our environment. As your iterative AAR journaling is what we'll call it. So you're issuing situation reports, which I think we may show you on the next slide, but you'll see here how I emphasize mission initiation and getting the scribe involved with this. So it's better team communication. You get concurrent memorialization in real time. So if you're familiar with Google Docs or Microsoft Docs, this concept of operational transformation algorithm where we can basically both communicate that kind of stuff. It increases accuracy of observations. That's huge, especially if you end up in any type of litigious situation. You've got a good standard of due care here. You probably have got good chain of custody. You've got good memorialization of the fight. A lot of times there's no litigation involved, but if there is, you've got really good data here for prosecution teams or, whatever you're going to do on the civil side if that happens. Fatigue management instrument being that because we can transfer, we're journaling data as we go, teams coming in that might have been, respite, and now they're coming into the fight while other teams are going out to take a breather. We can share information with each other. High fidelity of evidence recording, which is great for a chain of custody. Documented stream of intent, right? So we're telling our course of action, here's what we did. That's really critical because you may end up with a class action. And if you can prove that, hey, bad guys are good and we were doing our jobs and here was our documented stream of intent, you're probably going to come away with a good result. And there's probably a law firm that would disagree with that. And then of course, just posterity so that you've got a record of that and you could keep that for some number of years or a year, whatever your policy is on that. Here's an example of what a sit rep would look like. It's an update. We give you the date of the update. We give a course of action progress. So this is kind of cool because a lot of times the question you'll get from the brass is, where are we? How far down the field are we moved? Now this number grows, but you can give them a number. And eventually that number starts to become a little more static in terms of the denominator will become a little more static. And so if you can see that COA progress, 38%, maybe in the initial fight, we've got 31 COAs that we're going to, that we think we need to issue. That may grow, that may shrink, so that, of course, the percentage will change based on the numerator completion. But it gives you an idea of how you can communicate where we think we are, because that's what the brass is going to ask. Where do you think we're at? You know, how many more days do we have to go? How much more money is this going to cost me? That kind of stuff. So this is important. And then, of course, this is just, you know, showing the various sections of the courses of action, what we did for containment and eradication, for example, what we did to inventory our assets. If you look at that blue box on the right, you could kind of think of COAs. This is a really good model for you to think about. If you had to think about courses of action and what types of categories of courses of action you'd want to do, think about them this way. It's really easy to think about inventory plus 6 Ds. So inventory is just all the assets that are at my disposal, assets that have been compromised, assets that I can use to fight the enemy, that kind of stuff. And then detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, deceive, destroy. Like, issue your courses of action based on one of those verbs, one of those actions. Like, how do we detect them moving through the environment? How do we deny them? We can't deny them? Can we disrupt them? Can't disrupt them? Can we degrade them? Can't degrade them? Can we deceive them? And then, you know, how do we destroy them? And that doesn't mean those are dependent. You could be using all of those in parallel, but sometimes it's good. Let's deceive them. Let's put up a honeypot and see if there's anything left that they might be going for. You know, if you didn't know how to do that, I wouldn't recommend you do that during the fight. But if you had prepared for that, like, hey, if we get into a fight, let's make sure we've got a honeypot available to us so we can try to snare them during the fight. This would be the good way to think about it. And of course, the ultimate is to just, you know, destroy them. I mean, that's what they're trying to do to you. So, and just to finish up here, and then I'll stop and have someone come off mic. But just critical containment assets, this is critically important. Oftentimes people just don't know what they have available to them to fight. The number one thing I would say that's helped us as incident responders in the fights through a lot of things, including, you know, back in the day where we'd have to do complete memory, acquisition or disk acquisition is EDR. There's no doubt about that. So endpoint detection and response is in all the good, you know, sites that we help manage. And if you don't have it, you probably want to get the number one weapon. And the number one reason I would say for that, again, I haven't been on the ground in a long time, but it's because you can go to the point of attack. You can go to the actual endpoint to deal with the threat actor. And these might be ways to think about that. Where are they? How many do we have? Who owns them? Like, and I talk about friction. Like, sometimes, you know, in large companies, you know, you're dealing with one group that's, you know, they're just easier to deal with than other groups. So now you got to deal with a group that just generally gives you a hard time because their management sucks or whatever it is. They're just not in it to win it. And that, but so you probably want to go to them last. Probably want to go to people that are friendly, that are going to get you what you need, that understand that, you know, they're part of the team. And this is one way to think about that. Talked about incorporating IT support teams. I'll leave this slide up in case people were taking shots or they want it. But you need to market to your IT support teams. You know, I'll tell my teams still, even when I was, you know, running SOCs, you know, IT teams see you coming. They know you're not coming to take them to lunch. And so they're, you know, you're going to give them more work. That's what they see. And they don't work for you. They're not accountable to you. But as a security guy, you're going to give them more work. You know, go take them to lunch, talk to them, tell them what you're all about. Maybe there's some guys over there that actually be good, or guys and gals over there that'd be good for the team. Like, you're a team, and you just they happen to have a different role in the organization. But if you only ever see you when there's a problem, then that's what they're going to associate with you. So try to market to them and tell them about your value proposition and why working together is beneficial. Preparing business stakeholders, I won't go into that, but, you know, you got to create visibility, awareness that you're there, that you're capable, that you're competent, that you're relevant, that you can fight, that you know what you're doing, that kind of stuff. They're more likely to support you and get you what you need to get those threat actors out and done. And fatigue management, again, incident response is a highly dynamic ecosystem that often creates excess demand on human physiology. There is no doubt about that. Like, you could go to the dojo and fight somebody, you're going to get tired. Get on an incident response that lasts for a month, and, you know, you're going to be even more tired, especially because your brain is just, you know, in overload. It's unrealistic to think that humans can maintain that pace of prolonged IR and sustained critical thinking that a CSIRT mission demands. So you have to have fatigue management. It's that simple. Plus, Bob's going to a wedding on Friday. He's going to that wedding, and you're in the middle of the fight. You're going to lose Bob. Or, you know, Sally's going to the wedding, whatever it is, the point, or Alice is going to the wedding for you crypto fans. The question is like, do you have that replacement? Do you know how to deal with that? Do you have a contingency for that? Maybe during the fight, you know, Alice, you know, gets ill and she can't fight. How do you deal with that? All those things are critically important. Maybe they're just burnt out. They can't think anymore. They've had it. You know, I've seen people quit during incident response situations, not on our team, but at customer sites, because they just couldn't take it anymore. And that's just because their fatigue management wasn't in place. So this is an example of a scenario, and then I'll stop, but you can read that, this would be an example of how we would, do like, okay, you got a ransomware scenario, what's the alert source? How did that happen? What's the exercise objective? What capabilities are we exercising? And, what's the actual scenario? So I'll stop there, Parker, and see what we've got in terms of questions.
Thanks, John. All right, so folks, you can go ahead and put your questions in either in the Q&A panel, or I'll start looking for hands. If somebody would prefer just to raise their hand and be unmuted, because you all are in here unmuted currently. We did get some questions as you were talking, John, and we'll start with those. But the other thing I wanted to point out, you were just talking about the importance of kind of the walking around feedback. That is something, I was just in Nashville 2 weeks ago and at a information governance conference, and we heard from Teresa Payton, who was the first woman to lead the White House. She was the first security officer for the White House. And that was one of her #1 strategies for helping to revamp their cybersecurity stance and policy, and even their compliance of how quickly people were engaging, was literally to walk around and talk to the different departments, because she found that there were major gaps, both in training and even in trust in the tools and the systems of like, well, we don't really know how those work. You would think that people would have this, and certainly with the extensive resources of the government, you'd think that that would happen. And this isn't, another point that she made that I think bears being made here is that this isn't just for enterprise size organizations. Too often, John, we've seen people say, oh, this doesn't apply to us. We're too small. Nobody's going to try and target us. We've already been down that road. I did put a blog post up on denomasoftware.com last week, sort of with some of those highlights. So if that's of interest to you, be sure to also, and I'll put it in the links that we follow up after the event. But I think that walking around and soliciting feedback is super important. So, all right, let's look at some of these questions. Let me check for some hands. All right, looks like everybody wants to go with text. All right. The first question that came in is what's a brute force attack and how can you prevent it?
Yeah, so brute force attack is, traditionally associated with some type of authentication attack, where the threat actors are trying to get at a credential because they've got access, at least an interface to be able to get at that credential. And by credential, they want to compromise the credential of a particular user for whatever reason. It could possibly be that they conducted some OSINT on the user. They know they're an administrator, so they're trying to get into an asset. And it could just be a regular user. And once they're in, they will, they'll then go ahead and elevate privilege to what they need to do. The #1 way I would recommend to get, make that go away. And this doesn't apply, for all the purists out there. I get it, but it's multi-factor authentication. So if you can get some multi-factor authentication in place in your business, if you don't have that already today, you should be doing that. It's stupid simple to do. It's not going to prevent every single attack, but I think even today, statistically, it's still in the high 90s. Threat actors are, they get sophisticated. They work around that. But in that particular case, if they had, the way to beat MFA, for example, might be stealing session tokens or, cookies, if you will. But that wouldn't be a brute force attack. They would have those. So most of the time. So the answer to that question is, just implement MFA. Like if you don't do anything else and you don't have that in today, implement it. And it is available everywhere on pretty much any system that I've come across, or at least my teams have.
Okay. I'm going to direct this one to Eric. What's the difference between a vulnerability assessment and penetration testing?
A vulnerability assessment is the process of finding flaws in the organization. So you know that your network systems have flaws or weaknesses, and you want to find those and prioritize fixing them. In a penetration test, it's actually the process of finding vulnerabilities on a target, and then you want to find those and prioritize fixing them. So in a penetration test, it's actually the process of finding flaws or weaknesses, and you want to find those and prioritize fixing them. In a penetration test, it's actually the process of finding vulnerabilities on a target, So your organization sets up all the security measures that you can think of, puts all the protections in place, and then you get somebody to try to break those to see if the system can actually be hacked. And that's usually from the outside in.
Eric, this is probably a good one for you too. How do you protect backups from ransomware?
So you want to protect the backups. The best way to do that is actually start with a good backup procedure using the 3-2-1 rule, having 3 copies of your data, 2 on site on different types of devices, or at least different devices, and at least 1 copy off site. You can use snapshots on the SAN. That's not considered a backup, but it is actually a really good option to have in the event, depending on the dwell time of an attack, because replications usually don't go out that far, maybe 7 days. But the speed to restore is much quicker on the snapshot. On the repositories, you would look at immutable hardened Linux repositories. They're essentially almost like a worm tape that they can be written to, but nobody else in the organization can access it except the backup system. Keep those devices off the domain, keep them separate usernames, separate passwords. Use something like Veeam. Veeam is what we're a proponent of with offline restore capability. So you can actually bring those VMs back up in a sandbox and run remediation on them before doing restoration so that you know you're not restoring a compromised system back in the environment, which starts the whole process over. I mean, that's a mini disaster during one of these events. Certainly network segmentation, keep those things separated and least privileged so that you don't have any more exposure than you need. And if you're using Windows repositories, then certainly like using endpoint protection on those devices.
Okay. And the last question that's come in that I'm keeping an eye on the screen, but the last question I've got so far is why do I need an archive if I have a backup?
They are not the same thing. A backup is a copy of the current data that's used to restore data that's been damaged. An archive is historical data that you keep for long-term retention and compliance. Backups are typically for large-scale, fast recoveries. An archive is designed for individual data objects and access, such as emails or files or databases, along with their metadata, doing chain of custody, e-discovery. Did you want to have a complete record? The backup itself is something like an email server or Office 365 Exchange. Doesn't necessarily have a complete record of all the email. If somebody deletes an email, it goes to their deleted, they delete it from there, it goes to a dumpster, and then it lives for 14 days on default settings, and then it's gone. So in the backups, those things get moved out through retention, the snake eats its tail, and those things disappear. And an archive is a complete record of everything that's transversed that system.
This question's for John. John, can you bring up that model? We've got a question of what's the difference between a CCERT and IT support? And I think that diagram that you had, yeah, that one. Can you handle that question?
Sure. So, depending on the size of your organization, so let's take a large enterprise organization, they traditionally have dedicated security teams, and within that team will be a formation of a computer security incident response team. Now that may include individuals from the IT team, traditional technology teams. So let's say to just illustrate that, Active Directory administrators, that they're going to be part of the IT team, and your incident response from your SecOps teams, for example, will be part of the security team. A CCERT is the actual team, which will include maybe a collection of both of those, but traditionally it's just the security team that is designated within the organization or delegated with that charge. So it's security teams and versus IT teams. But in large organizations, you may have a member of the IT support team hire senior member as part of a CCERT if a CCERT is called. So a CSIRT would be, hey, we're calling a computer security incident response team. We call them missions at GuardSight. Other companies call them different things. That would be a collection of those bodies of individuals that are going to go now engage and take care of that, particular situation. And the IT support teams are the teams like the firewall teams, the directory, Active Directory teams, maybe the provisioning teams. That's actually a really good point there, is provisioning. So you've got to provision some things. So it might be like you don't have a particular weapon that the CSIRT team wants to, as a course of action, wants the IT support team to provision into the environment. That's pretty common. And so what they'll say to the team is, hey, we need this provisioned on all assets, for example. In the old days, back in the day, we may not have done that, but that's pretty common today, where we'll just, the objective is to contain the enemy, because that's the number one objective, versus like, hey, we have to preserve every single thing that we have, every morsel of evidence. It's like, let's provision these tools. And so an IT support team would handle that. So the main two differences are CSIRT teams have, overall authority to issue and manage the cyber attack, the fight, and the IT support teams are there to support them in, various provisioning or containment courses of action.
Thanks. See if anybody else, some questions have come in via chat, some have come in through the Q&A. Just as a reminder, I did put that out in the chat because I've gotten this question a couple times. The presentation, the links, the recording, resources, all of that will be made available after the event. We want to give people the resources to help you get started on, many of you may already have an existing strategy, but then you can evaluate and optimize for it. So all of that's going to be provided. Let's see. I am not seeing anybody wanting to talk live. So there's no hands. And it looks like we've gotten to everything in the Q&A and the chat. So we'll go ahead and return everybody 10 minutes in their day. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found this helpful, educational, and ideally our goal is to help organizations be more secure, more prepared, because the last thing we want to see are more headlines. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Parker. Thank you, everybody.
Right.